I think that we can probably kick off, and if anyone joins us late, I'm sure they can catch up. So again, thanks to everyone for joining. My name is Sajanya Gamadjala. I'm the communications manager for Capricorn Power. And I'd really like to thank you for coming again today. I know that everyone has extremely busy lives, so we really, really appreciate you taking out this 30, 45 minutes out on a Thursday for us. And before I start, I would like to acknowledge that this meeting is being held on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respect to elders both past, present, and future. And before we kick off with our conversation with Shaun today, I wanted to get some housekeeping out of the way. So if you're joining, I assume, I don't know how else you get here, but I assume you know that we're in the middle of our capital raise on the virtual platform. So I assume some of you have some questions about that. And after the conversation with Shaun, we'll actually be doing a Q&A, and I'll invite our CEO, Mike Hodgkinson, to join us as well later for that Q&A. So if you have you can have conversations about microgrids for Shaun, and then we can talk about some capital raise questions as well later. And if you have them during the webinar, you can use the Q&A or the chat function to do that. And I should introduce who's in the box above me or below me, depending on how you're viewing this. Shaun, hello, how are you?
Bad, Sajanya. How are you going? I'm
great, thanks. So Shaun is actually our general manager of products, and he, if you hadn't guessed by the title of this, he knows a bit about microgrids. And I've learned a lot more about microgrids just from working at Capricorn Power and getting really interested in energy and renewable energy. And so I thought we would just kick off with really easy question. Shaun, what got you interested in renewable energy in the first place?
Well, it's a bit of a long journey, so I'll summarize it very quickly. About 22 years ago, I got involved with the Alternative Technology Association because I was interested in renewable energy, and they're now called Renew. And I did a bit of voluntary work with their solar shuttle, which is a trailer with solar panels and other energy efficiency stuff on it, which I proceeded to drive around to things like royal exhibitions and local fairs and explain as best as I could what this was all about, renewable energy and energy efficiency in particular. It helps being an electrical engineer. So it grew out of my discipline area interest. And so then I embarked on a master's of science in renewable energy in about 2001, finished in 2009, looked around for jobs at that time, but that was in a slump in the renewables energy, if people recall. Not such a good time to be looking for work in that. But then I joined Planet Arc in 2013 and was able to found one of three for-purpose ventures you'd call as a startup these days. And that one was Planet Arc Power, which was to actually bring commercial and industrial solar to business who were falling behind and not taking advantage of the numerous business benefits that that solar has for the commercial and industrial space. So that involved me learning how to sell commercial and industrial solar pretty much cold in front of people who were looking at me saying, why should I buy solar from you? And so that was very brutal. Sales is a binary thing. You either win it or you don't. So I learned a lot from that in terms of what customers want and answer the questions and the needs they have. That was a very important learning for me. But then Capricorn Power came along and I saw the opportunity to turn what is a wasted resource, it's just a resource, we just waste it, into something of value. And heat is really valuable if you use in processes, manufacturing processes, but we can also turn it into electricity, which is used at just about every business I know of. And most businesses complain about what they pay for it. And so we're here to help with that. So that's how I got into renewable energy, because I see the stuff we're doing is linked to creating sustainable energy solutions for business.
Yeah, I love hearing everyone's story about how they came to Capricorn, but also just got really interested in renewables. So I mentioned that obviously I learned a lot more about microgrids, the last few years with Capricorn, and all of our passion about like kind of getting over this climate crisis or helping with it. So I think they're really fascinating, but I think maybe there might be some people on the webinar that don't know too much about microgrids. Would you actually mind giving us like a little short explainer of what they are?
Sure. Now, I guess this is where we cue the slides. I'll just share my screen, and we'll just go through a handful of slides. So don't despair. I'm not going to slide you to death. So you should see in the next moment or so a screen that says what the problem is with renewable energy. Can you see that, Sejanya?
So yeah, that's great. Thanks.
You can, everyone else can. So the problem is that renewable energy is variable at a local scale, particularly, which just means the sun doesn't blow, the sun doesn't shine, and the wind doesn't blow all the time at all places. So what do? Well, you get a battery and store it. That's one solution. And we've got some other ideas in terms of what you would do. Let me just advance. So the solution is making renewable energy on demand at local scale. It seems obvious. It's not. It's variable. Now we want to make it more schedulable or on demand. And so to do that, one of the ways we can do that is by supporting a microgrid to be a 24/7 operation. And so what is a microgrid, you might ask? And that's the next logical question here. There's only 2 slides after this. So that's probably the shortest slideshow you've ever had. So a microgrid is basically a set of one or more independent power sources, and it can operate independently from the grid to supply the demand of, say, a single business through to a whole community. So the grid we have that we're all connected to now is a huge grid. It's across the country, it's huge. And what I'm talking about is a small version of that can supply just a factory or the entire community independently from the grid, should you lose the grid. And that is a microgrid. So that's what it is. And so you can have a number of different renewable energy sources. As you can see, solar, wind, energy storage is there, which we talked about a little bit before, generator, and also things like combined heat and power systems can form part of that microgrid. And that microgrid is coordinated by some type of software that optimizes what you use and when. And indeed, sometimes you may send that back to the grid and get paid handsomely for it. So it opens up some other opportunities for making a business case for a microgrid. So let me talk about where we fit in here. So what we've done is we've created a power system out of a bioenergy source, a biomass source. And biomass is just anything that's living plant or animal that you can utilize to create heat. So we do that through a process called pyrolysis, which heats the biomass up, doesn't burn it. It just burns the gases that come off it to then render that biomass into charcoal, which we call biochar because it comes from biomass. And so that's the biochar bit. What's left over is quite a bit of excess heat, and that's where the heat engine comes from. And that's the middle box you see there. That's our heat engine. That's what we're commissioning at the moment. And so you get bioenergy out of that. And it is on demand because if you have biomass, you just feed it in and electricity and heat comes out, or heat and then electricity comes out. Our heat engine also produces a stream of some heat that can be used in industrial processes as well. So there's a couple of streams of value that come out of that. The biochar is very valuable for a soil amendment, and we can talk about that a little bit later, but essentially it's an integrated bioenergy power station that we create. And so where does that fit in the diagram that you saw just previously? Well, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. The benefits of that, though, are that we get cheaper energy, it's much more reliable, and can provide grid support, which I mentioned before. By grid support, you can provide extra generation into the grid that's needed by, say, another microgrid down the road, for instance. So you're balancing up supply and demand at a local level. It's quite, there's a lot to this, and I'm not doing it justice here particularly. So where does our box of tricks fit? Well, it fits in the container that you see there in the middle. So we are a power generation source, energy generator, and we provide energy back from that into the microgrid controller, which distributes it to the various loads as needed. So effectively, we've got a independent source of power that's available on demand, and it's renewable. And that's pretty much it.
Right. And that kind of leads me into my next couple questions. You obviously touched on biochar, and for everyone else that isn't as familiar with that with us. So we are able to take waste and use it as a valuable resource, as Shaun mentioned. And I wanted you to talk about kind of one of those valuable resources. So I know that you're, people might not know this, you're actually an advisory board member of the Australia and New Zealand Biochar Industry Group. I thought that I would give that little plug. So can you talk to us a bit more, I know since you know a fair bit about it, could you talk to us a bit more about biochar and a little bit more about how that would play into the microgrid?
Sure, yeah. And I'll say at the outset, I'm not an expert in biochar, but I've learned quite a lot in the last year or so about it. And I've had some very good teachers from ANZBIG who have been doing this much longer than I have. And if you feel so inclined, please support ANZBIG in their mission to really get biochar on the map. And that's what we're trying to do here as well. So look, biochar is just charcoal. So if you've ever had a fire and you see those black bits down the bottom, that's charcoal. That's what we're talking about. So it's nothing more special than that, but it is pretty special. So as I mentioned, it comes from any plant or animal. So the structure of plants or animals holds carbon, and you can reduce that to charcoal by heating it. And so it can be anything from green waste from gardens, food waste, pre and post consumer, manufacturing waste. And I hate using the term waste because it's just resources that we haven't been clever enough to use. And that's how we should look at resources. And a lot of people do, but we just need to get that word waste out of there's no such thing as waste in nature. As we know, there's just nutrients for another cycle. So it's very important that we just maybe get that into our mindset, and that will inform our designs. And the circular economy is based on that natural principle as well. So biochar is hugely beneficial to soil. It can retain water, so you have to use less water. It can stop pesticide runoff, but make those nutrients available for plants. So you use less of that, and you don't get runoff into the reef, for instance. So there's a bit of work being done in Queensland to stop runoff using biochar in soils. And it can also retain heavy metals and lock them up. And so it actually improves the quality and the function of the soil to do what it does best, which is grow stuff. So that's what biochar does. And so by putting biochar back into the soil, you're actually regenerating the soil and adding capacity, adding agricultural capacity, adding capacity to clean our water system. There's so many benefits, it's hard to list them all, but it's a wonder product. It's not a carbon bullet, but it's pretty much like that. It's a very, very powerful product. And so whenever you make biochar, there is always excess heat. So when you use a process called pyrolysis, which is that heating I talked about earlier, there's always some excess heat, and that excess heat generally just goes up the chimney. So what we're doing, we're intercepting that, taking it through our engine and turning it into electricity. So together, biochar production and our heat engine are better together. So just pyrolysis by itself, yep, that's got a business case. If you go, well, let's add our engine to it, and we can take that heat and create some value from it, suddenly you've got a package which is much better together. So that's how I like to look at it. And so once we understand that that's a nice tight bundle, if you like, we can start selling it as a foundation for the microgrid because it's on demand. So that's the point. So that's really the end of that little rant. Sorry if I went on a bit.
No, I think that's good. I think it's good to explain like how that our integrated bioenergy power station actually fits into the microgrid system. And speaking of which, I guess I want to kind of ask you more about how you think that system fits into the larger microgrid, like, I don't know, community, I guess, system. And, what sorts of customers we see using our systems in Australia, and then obviously like globally as well.
That's a great question, because what we're doing is trying to solve a problem or an unmet demand, if you like, in our product development. And so think about it, if you think about it this way, say you're in a semi-rural agricultural community, they harvest olives, and there's this waste issue with the pips that have to go somewhere. That could be turned into biochar, and that can be used to power the community and provide energy for the community as a whole. And if you have a number of different agricultural sources, you can convert anything into biochar, and you have heat and you have electricity. So it pretty quickly it gets not out of control, but there's so many different options you have to create energy for just the business that's processing that product, that resource that you have available that you'd either burn or bury normally. So landfill, so it's a disposal problem. So you've solved that problem. You generate electricity for the business, and all businesses need electricity. So, but you might even generate too much. So the community can benefit from that energy going through the community. And think about a number of different agricultural processing plants around that are doing this at their local scale, all pumping energy back into that local area. So it becomes perhaps a wider microgrid. So maybe it's a macro grid, not the grid, but it's a larger collection. And it could be that you've got a few microgrids that cooperate with each other. So it could be that geographically you might have sort of a regional cooperation of microgrids that you put together. So it's quite endless in terms of the possibility, but you have to do the maths and the sums, and does it make sense, and what's the cost to do it from a resource perspective. Often the resource to make the heat is free, and that's the point. But actually it's not free, it's negative, because you have to pay to dispose of it. Now you don't. So that's one of the benefits of that. So that's how I see. So it's businesses who have a waste disposal problem and might have a biomass waste disposal problem. It's communities that want to have more supply resilience because it's not reliable for them. So they want some local generation so they can benefit from that. So it can be a community type microgrid. There are a number of microgrids being set up around the country. A lot of them are based on solar, some wind, but with battery storage. With what we're proposing is that the battery is in the biomass, which is very efficient as a battery when you think about it. You just convert it when you need it. And there's no end of life issues with the battery. You've got a lithium-ion battery that's 10 years old. We've got to dispose of it. With biomass, you don't have that. Like, you don't have that end of life problem. So that's what I see as the main target audience for that is many, many different communities around Australia.
Yep. And thanks for that. That was a great kind of framing of how our heat engine fits in, I think. And before we get to the larger Q&A with Mike, if everyone, this is our CEO, Mike Hodgkinson. But one more question for you, Shaun. So this is kind of a loftier question, but in your opinion, what do you think Australia needs to do to meet the Paris goals by 2030?
It's a big...
Not to get too political or anything, just...
I'm going to stay apolitical. I'm going to focus on what we really need to do in Australia. And look, policy and targets around emissions reductions are key, and we just need to get those right and harmonised across all levels of government in Australia. That's step one. But the rollout of distributed energy is continuing apace. So we can form that distributed energy into things like microgrids or just distributed solar farms or whatever, but we've got to know how to manage those and to be able to exchange fair value of that stuff. So we need some regulatory support from the market operators and from the market regulators that will allow us to exchange energy more freely than we can now. And I will say there's a bit of change happening in this space, but it is far from what we need to do to create the future that supports really 100% renewable, if that's where we're heading, which has a large role to play in reducing or decarbonising our community or our environment, our world. But it's not the only thing we have to do, but it is certainly a very important thing. So I'm not saying it's the only thing we have to do, but it's very important that we allow the local generation and distribution of power without any barriers that make these projects unviable, because the current structure is oriented towards monolithic centralised power stations, generally speaking. So that's the transition. We're going from central to distributed. How do we do that quickly and efficiently? That's the challenge. That really is the challenge. And we need to transition as quickly as we can, because this improves the outcomes for not only the environment, but social outcomes in terms of the availability of electricity at a cost that people can afford. Yeah. And that's key.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that, Shaun. I think we might move to the Q&A. So for everyone, Mike Hodgkinson has joined us, our CEO. And I wanted to kick off with the first question. Shaun, this might be for you. We have a question. Does the heat to make the pyrolysis come from, 1, the heat of composting, or 2, waste heat from some other process?
So you have to kick off the pyrolysis process with some heat, and then it's auto-generating. So it keeps going by itself. There's enough excess gas to keep it heating and generating as it flows through the process. So what's a good example of that is that if you're looking into the flames of the fire, what you're seeing burning is gas. That's the gas that we use to heat to generate the charcoal. So typically you use a gas bottle that heats up initially to get you going, and once you're going, you turn that off. And it's a self exothermic sort of reaction, or auto-generating reaction. So that's where the energy comes from. It comes from itself, but you have to kick it off.
Great. And this next question, I think, is for Mike. So what are the major operational milestones and re-rating catalysts over the next 6 to 12 months?
Yeah, great question. So starting operations, and then 100 hours is classically seen as the first most important milestone, and then 1,000 hours is typically seen as what's called ARENA Technical Readiness Level 9, the sort of measurement of that that demonstrates that you've got a reliably working, mature product, and obviously continue running after that. So that's our primary milestone. That's important for setting up obviously future sales, and we also have the Ostend Bioenergy project. We need to complete some technical reports for the EPA and for council, and then to have those accepted, and then we can get on with the order of the equipment and the project. So that would be the second operational milestone, and the third would be creating a scaled up what we call a Mark III heat engine design. So something of a significant scale that customers are that we can make an impact with, sort of 200 kilowatt type level, and that there's plenty of customer demand for. So those would be the 3 key operational milestones.
Great. I think the next question for either one of you, actually, it's around what kind of companies or which companies actually our feasibility studies are for. But maybe we won't say who they are actually, but maybe we can talk about what kinds of companies the feasibility studies are for.
Sure. So we achieved 5 paid feasibility studies during last financial year, and 4 of them were for bioenergy projects. So a char maker, a continuous pyrolysis process that took a biomass stream and turned it into biochar and electricity. And one was for an existing wastewater treatment plant, or sludge plant actually. And so 4 of them showed very positive prospects for follow-on projects. And the 5th, the sludge plant actually wasn't generating enough thermal energy. And that's the nature of feasibility studies, obviously, to learn early whether they're financially viable to develop further or not. But we can't, unfortunately, mention the name of a couple of those organisations.
And I think, well, this might be for both, but Shaun, the next question is about how much waste does make sense for the integrated bioenergy power station? How much waste would an organization need to have for that to make sense for them?
I mean, I'm going to say it depends, but say we're looking at 10,000 tonnes per annum of biomass for a green waste project that we're doing. Which sounds like a lot, but actually it isn't. So it depends on the type of waste and the energy content within it as to how much makes it viable. So it does depend, and we're more than happy to work with anyone who's got a waste stream to establish what that would look like. But it is certainly thousands of tonnes per year, many thousands of tonnes per year to make it viable. And Mike, you might want to comment on that because you've been working on some.
That's right. So there's really a what we would call a techno-commercial assessment to be had, that it's technically feasible, and the minimum there is probably around the 3,000 tonne per annum mark, sort of technically, if you like, and then there will be commercial factors that can be quite variable from project to project, be it whether a gate fee is available for the processing of the waste, for example, because someone's avoiding a transport and or a landfill levy cost. The carbon price, what that is at the moment, will determine, could be a key input as well, because with biochar you get a 3.6 leverage. So European carbon price, I think, as I've mentioned before, of $50 a tonne can almost make these projects viable on their own. And then if the customer has both a heat and an electricity need, and of course the heat offsets gas, which is quite expensive at the moment, then that would be in favour of a smaller project being commercially viable as well. But unfortunately, there's no easy answer to that, which is why these projects assessments, feasibility assessments, need to be conducted.
I think we might have time for 1 or 2 questions, just so I know if you're living in Victoria, you might need to do things before midnight, before the lockdown. So Mike, we have a question about if Capricorn plans on listing on the ASX anytime soon.
So our goal, first I should say the future is hard to forecast, right? But our goal is to aim for an ASX listing in 2 to 3 years. We have we're keeping a pretty close eye on companies in the clean tech space that have listed as sort of reference companies, and we're essentially doing all the things that we believe we need to do, like becoming a public company, auditing our accounts, creating independent directors and good corporate governance, so that process will flow and we'll be able to make that in that sort of time frame. But we certainly hear the very loud and clear from shareholders that a liquidity event in 2 to 3 years is a preference. So we acknowledge that absolutely.
Great. I think, just to keep it short and sweet, so in case everyone needs to get on to doing other things, if you have more questions, obviously feel free to email us at info@capricornpower.com.au. And if you have invested, thank you so much. We really appreciate the support. And if you haven't, you can always go onto our virtual campaign page and invest now until Tuesday. We close at midnight on Tuesday. And again, always consider the risk warning and offer document before investing, and follow us on social media. Thanks everyone. Thanks Shaun. Thanks Mike.
Thanks, Jania. See you, Mike.